Okay, thank God. Kareem was about to lose his job. Okay, so let's talk about what we're talking about today. And what is that topic? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about compression ratio. A lot of people nowadays, they've switched from pump gas. They're using a lot more E85, or they're running race gas. So even on turbocharged applications and supercharged applications, they're looking at increasing their compression ratio in order to increase their performance. At least that's what they think they're doing. And today we're going to talk about, first off, what compression ratio is. That'll be our first thing. Let's just write that down first right here. So our first topic we're going to do is, what is compression ratio? Now, it might also be referred to as a static compression ratio. And that just means it's a thing that's fixed on the engine. And let's talk about what fixes it. Well, probably one of the things that everybody talks about with an engine is its size, its displacement. So right now, let's look at our theoretical engine. We're going to look at a 2-liter engine, and it's going to be a 4-cylinder. Okay? And 2 liters is 2,000 cc's. So if we have 4 cylinders, all of the equal size, and they're 500 cc's each, we have a total of 2 liters or 2,000 cc's. So we've basically got 500 cc times 4 cylinders. And that's going to give us 2,000 cc's. Okay. So that's what displacement is. So you may also know that in an engine, there's only 2 things that determine the displacement of the engine. It has nothing to do with rod length, with compression height of the piston, with the deck height of the block. None of that has anything to do with the displacement of the engine. Only 2 factors, bore and stroke. Okay, those are the only 2 things. So let's talk about that 500 cc. So if we have, let's see here. Let's draw a little cylinder here. So this is our cylinder. And in there we've got a piston. Maybe something looks like this or something. Okay, here's our piston. Here's the rest of the cylinder. Okay, so this is our cylinder. This is our, up here is our the deck surface of our block and all that kind of stuff. So the 2 things that matter are the bore, how big the area of this circle is here. This is our bore. And then our stroke. How much is that piston moving to where it's at its bottom dead center and top dead center? So a real popular one nowadays for a 2-liter 4-cylinder is a square one, which is very close to 86 by 86. You know, the FA20 has this, a few other engines have this. 86 by 86 is a very common one. So let's just say that that's what we have. So right now we've got a 500 cc, and these won't give you exactly 500 cc's, but just so you know about the ballpark. So for example, this is an FA20 piston. So this piston right here has a bore size of 86 millimeters. That diameter right here is about 86 millimeters on this piston. It's a little smaller because there's a little clearance there, but the hole it goes in is exactly 86 millimeters. And then how much it moves up and down in that cylinder is 86 millimeters. Okay, and that's how we get displacement. So displacement is something that's very important when you're talking about compression ratio, because right here we have 500 cc's. This is 500 cc's of water, and I put a small amount of dye in here so you can see kind of, it represents something that we're going to talk about in a second, which is the density of this. But this is our little example right here. If somebody finds me something to set this on, I'll set it on so you guys can do that. But what happens is, all this volume here, when this piston, that's when the piston's at bottom dead center, we have 500 cc's in here. But actually, what ends up happening when this piston comes back up to top dead center, all right, so here's our piston in the cylinder, and now it's at the top. Well, now there's just this volume here. And this is called the unswept volume. The displacement volume of the cylinder, that's called the swept volume because the piston's actually sweeping down in the bore and coming back up. That's your swept volume. So this is your swept volume. And this is your unswept volume. So, what does that mean? Well, let's look. I have some examples here that were already mixed up. So, we started with this much volume in the cylinder at bottom dead center. Actually, we had this plus some, what the unswept was. But anyways, we started with basically this, and then we're squishing it into this much space. So you could see it actually even gets darker. That's kind of representative of the density. So we've taken something that had that many air molecules in it in this much space, and now we've crushed it into this space. That's what happens when we compress something in the engine. So as you change the compression ratio, this represents 8 to 1. This represents 10 to 1. And then we go down to 12 to 1. And all the way to, let's see here, this is 14 to 1. Joe, scoot that in over here. And we'll just lay these here. So let's see here. You guys got an idea a little bit of what happens. So the piston comes up, it's crushing everything that's in there, and now we have, before ignition and before a power stroke, we have a much smaller volume that we're actually going to be working with. Now, 10 to 1 compression ratio. Let's just start with that one. So a 10 to 1, I'm going to have to put on my glasses here. All right, our 10 to 1, let me look here. I made a little chart to help us out. So if our unswept volume, let's say our unswept is, we're going to say 55.6, okay? And we know our swept volume is 500 cc's. What's the total volume in that cylinder? So we've got the swept volume of 500 cc's, and we got this little extra space up here, the unswept volume. How would we get that? Anyone? Just add it, right? So we're going to end up with 555.6 cc. That's our total amount. So at the very most that could be filled in the cylinder is what's swept plus what's unswept. That's the most you can pack in there, okay? Unless you change the pressure of that. But at atmospheric pressure, that's the most we can get stuffed in there. Is 556 cc's. Now, if we take this total amount and then we look at just the 55.6 number, we'll see, actually it should be 55 point, whatever. But if you look, this is 10 times bigger than this. So that means 10 to 1. So for a 10 to 1 on a 500 cc, we've got a total volume here of 55.6. Do we have any questions so far? No? So far so good? All right, good. Okay, so that's a 10 to 1. Now, what would, let's write out some different ratios here. 8 to 1, 10 to 1, 12 to 1, and 14 to 1. Give you an idea of what those numbers would be. This has 71.4 cc's of unswept volume. This has about 55.6 cc's. This is 45.5 cc, and this is 38.5 cc. So you see, although we started out with a larger amount, it's getting crushed down into a smaller amount. Now here's the interesting thing. Our total volume here is 571.4 because we have 500 as our swept. This is our unswept volume. In the 10 to 1 case, we actually have less that we can fill up than an 8 to 1. 556.0. I'm sorry, 555.6, sorry. 555.6. Here we have 5 545.5, and here we have 538.5. Okay, so our total amount of volume we have also changes with compression ratio. Okay, not just the swept volume, but also the total volume. So this is our total volume, and this is our swept. Okay, so what does all this mean? Seems like lots of math. Well, let's talk about, first off, what increasing the compression ratio does. Okay, and I got some notes here. All right. So you may have heard or you may understand that on a all-motor application, raising the compression ratio is often a way to make some additional horsepower. And it's a pretty popular way. And some of these guys with these all-motor combinations, they might be running some insane compression ratios, 15 to 1, 17 to 1, whatever the number might be. So what happens when you raise the compression ratio? Okay, so increasing compression ratio. And guys out there that are shooting this stuff, if there's a question and stuff, just get my attention. I'll try to answer it. Do we have a question?
Yes. It says, what about fuel evaporation time? Is that affected? Less time to vapor molecules?
Yeah, we're going to get into that. There's a lot of things that happen in addition to, it doesn't seem like it's all that important, but taking something that's so big and crushing it down, it does make a lot of differences. So let's first talk about what are the advantages of increasing the compression ratio. And this is one of the things that kind of leads people down the wrong route, because you don't always want to increase compression ratio to make more power, and we're going to get into that. That's kind of the real takeaway from this. Now, first off, it is going to increase the thermal efficiency of the engine. What the heck does that mean? Is what you're saying right now, because I'm looking at Bassam's face, and that's always a good indicator. Right now, increasing the thermal efficiency. Well, the energy that you put in your engine is the gasoline or whatever fuel you're using, your E85. That's your energy source. Now, the percentage of that energy that actually gets converted into horsepower is usually just on the magnitude of maybe 35 to 40%. The majority of that energy actually goes out through the exhaust pipe. It goes into the cooling system. There's a lot of wasted heat that's used. It's used to overcome friction. So there's a lot of things going on there. So the thermal efficiency, what that means is for every drop of fuel you got going into the engine, you're converting a higher percentage of that into horsepower, which in terms of fuel economy, I mean, that can be a really, really advantageous thing there. Can you just zoom in on this? And I'll just talk over it. So if we look at this chart here, this chart right here shows what your original compression ratio was and then what your new compression ratio is. And if we look at this, if the car originally had a fuel economy of 20 miles per gallon, you see that if you had an 8-to-1 car and you went all the way up to a 14-to-1, well, just the compression ratio change alone, you'd be getting 23 point, whatever that number is. 1, is it? Yeah, 23.1 it looks from the back here. You'd be getting that much of an increase in fuel efficiency. So that's one of the great things about increasing your compression ratio is that goes up. What also goes up is somebody was talking about like what's happening when you're squeezing this stuff more together. Things that are happening is yeah, you're getting probably better vaporization of the fuel. You're getting better mixing going on in there. And what tends to happen is your burn rate actually increases. And that's normally a pretty good thing, because what you want to have happen once ignition happens, you want that burn to basically take place as fast as possible without detonating and transfer that rise in pressure at the right point in the crankshaft rotation so we make more torque and horsepower. That's really what we're trying to do. So having a faster burn rate, that could be a good thing. That usually also requires less ignition timing for peak torque. And you know an engine's running right when it has the minimum amount of timing to get your peak torque. That's when it's tuned properly. There's a lot of people who do not do that. They think they're making the engine very safe by running the ignition timing very retarded. And that's one of the best ways to burn up exhaust valves, put a lot of heat in your cooling system, and just cause a lot of stress that's not really doing anything. But there's a lot of people that, you know, they tune an engine and they just crank up the boost, retard the timing, add a crap load of fuel and think that that's the way to do it, and they think that's safe. Actually, that's causing lots of issues with it. But let's get back to increasing the compression ratio. So we increase the thermal efficiency, the burn rate increases, less ignition timing. So far so good. It sounds good. Now, there are drawbacks. We have a lower potential volumetric efficiency. Now, what the heck is volumetric efficiency? Okay, so we talked about the cylinder being 571 cc's on an 8-to-1. Is the total cylinder volume of the cylinder plus, I'm sorry, the total volume of the swept plus the unswept was 571. Now look, as we go up, this number goes down. As we go up in compression ratio, the amount of total cc's we have in their cylinder goes down. So the problem we have there is you can only fit so much in there. So although we're increasing thermal efficiency, we're decreasing volumetric efficiency. Does that make sense? So we're making a gain in one area, we're having a loss in another area. So how those balance out is kind of interesting. And if we look, and I think I did one here. All right. So if we look at just, I could take some of these numbers, or, you know, we're actually going to have a version of this on YouTube with all the charts and stuff like that. We're going to also have an article click link on here that you can go to. It'll take us about a week to finish it, but I'll have all the charts in there. We might even put some calculators in there to make it really easy, so you can just plug in what your current compression ratio is, what you're thinking about going to, and what's going to happen if you make those choices. So if we look at this, I mean, at the end of the day, here's kind of what happens on an all-motor application. So an all-motor application, we can look right here. This is what happens. If we started out at 8-to-1 and we go all the way to 14-to-1, we're going to make 8.8% more power. You know, so if we had a 200 horsepower engine, we just went to 217.7, changing from 8-to-1 to 14-to-1. I mean, that sounds like a good deal, and in fact, that's what happens here, and you can see where the gains are. Now, if you had a 12-to-1 engine, okay, let's say you had an FA20 engine, which is pretty close to that in a BRZ or FRS 86, whatever, and let's just say that the factory compression ratio, original compression ratio, is 12-to-1. Now, let's say you put a piston in there that makes it 10-to-1 because you're going to be boosting on it. Well, you do lose a little bit there. You lose a little bit there when the boost isn't on, though, and we'll get into that. But so when you're off boost, when you're just relying on the atmosphere and stuff, you lost 5 horsepower with that compression ratio change. Now, what's interesting is as you increase the boost, those numbers change. So we look at that same situation. Now we've got a 400 horsepower FA20, let's say, and it runs 15 pounds of boost. So now if we started out at 12-to-1 and we went down to 10-to-1, we only lose 3.3 horsepower. We actually lost less horsepower, total horsepower, than we did. And in fact, on top of that, as a percentage, it went down. Okay, and let's continue with that same thing. Now we've got a 30-pound turbo system on there, and now we're making a 600 horsepower FA20. And we started at 12-to-1, and we go to 10-to-1, and guess what? We just gained horsepower by doing that. So it is really interesting what's happening. You have two things happening. You have thermal efficiencies going up with compression ratio. You have volumetric efficiencies going down. So there's actually an optimum compression ratio based on what you're doing. And it's really the form of racing, what you're trying to accomplish If you're in a form of racing where they have fuel ups and they need really good efficiency, they're going to run higher compression ratios in order to increase that fuel economy. If they're running in something where it's not fuel limited, where they don't have to do refilling and stuff like that, the optimum compression ratio will probably be a lot lower than that. So I'm sure there's some questions so far. Let's start answering them.
You answered the fuel evaporation question. Another one is not really a question, I think he's answering him. It says turbo engine that isn't a knock limited fuel, but without stronger head bolts, better to lower compression and run more boost than high compression and lower boost as peak cylinder pressure is less.
Peak cylinder pressure is 100% equal to torque output. That's all it is. So regardless if you get there with more boost and less timing, or less boost and more timing, at the end of the day, it's just about torque output. Now, what can happen is when that peak pressure happens in the cylinder, that can change here and there, and you might actually have something that works better with one setup than the other. One of the interesting things you can measure on an engine is the less amount of ignition timing we talked about, the less amount of ignition timing that you need to run in order to make peak torque, the more efficient the engine is. So that's always one parameter. If you make a tuning change and it requires more ignition timing to make the same horsepower, you've went backwards. You kind of want to go the opposite way of that. Let's see here. I want to make sure I covered all of these. So let me just throw my glasses again. Apologize for that. All right, so higher compression ratio, better thermal efficiency, faster burn rates, less ignition advance, lower potential V. The other thing that tends to happen with higher, increasing the compression ratio, another negative, is you usually have higher temps at ignition. As something gets more compressed, its temperature tends to go up. So that's one of the reasons why you're more likely to potentially encounter detonation, because you have higher ignitions or auto ignition. You have higher temperatures at ignition. So pre-ignition and stuff like that is more likely to happen with a higher compression ratio. And, so you've got pre-ignition to deal with, and you also have detonation and detonation. So those are the two things that happen when you increase the compression ratio. What happens when you decrease the compression ratio? Everything flips. We get a decrease in thermal efficiency. Our burn rate slows down. There's less ignition timing for peak torque. I'm sorry, it needs more ignition timing to get peak torque. Higher volumetric efficiency is the plus. Lower temps at ignition and lower chance of pre-ignition and detonation. So the old rule of the higher you're going to boost an engine, the less the compression ratio should be, actually still applies. Even though we have a better fuel out there that has higher octane and higher knock resistance, and a really good way of cooling the intake charge, like with the 85 and all that alcohol just sucking the heat out of it. Even though we have that, that doesn't necessarily mean you want to build a 12-to-1 race engine that's going to run at 45 pounds of boost. It's really interesting where that crossover happens. And in this case, we already showed that just even at about, I think the crossover point on the FA20 is once you get above about 20 pounds of boost, or 22 pounds of boost, somewhere in that range, you're already making the same exact power if you change the compression ratio from 12-to-1 down to 10-to-1. Now, we have simplified things a little bit. There's one thing that we haven't introduced that is a factor, and it kind of comes back a little bit to that question about the fuel vaporization and stuff. And that's the one thing that we haven't talked about. We talked about thermal efficiency. All right, we know what thermal efficiency is. And that's basically, that's the percent that is the power versus the percent of the total energy in the fuel. Okay, that's our thermal efficiency. Our volumetric efficiency, let's see, volumetric effic. My handwriting is terrible. Volumetric efficiency, that's the percentage of the swept volume that gets filled. So on a 500 cc engine, or 500 cc cylinder, if you're at 80%, 400 cc's out of the 500 are going to be filled. If you have a 500 cc engine, but 571 cc's are filled, more than 100%, and that can happen when you have the space to do it. Let's see, I think I made that computation here. That would be, where'd it go? 114% would be the VE if you were able to fill all that up. So it gives you kind of an idea. Yeah, so we got a question.
Is there a reason people go to 12-to-1 plus on boost on, say, ethanol or methanol? Is it just a bit of a trendy thing, or is it because they have such big duration cams so the dynamic compression is less?
It could be a number of factors. You know, one of the things that we're seeing is people not understanding everything that's going on. You know, there are trends out there right now. A lot of engines have switched to direct gasoline injection with turbocharging, okay? And other engines are using other technologies and stuff out there, such as variable cam timing and all that. Let's see if we can silence this phone. All right, so the question is it right to do? Well, it all depends on the setup. Let's see, can we not kill that phone? It is very distracting. Okay, so repeat the question to me. I totally lost it here, sorry.
Is there a reason people go to 12-to-1 plus on boost on, say, ethanol or methanol? Is it because it's a bit of a trendy thing?
Well, I think it's out of ignorance is 90% of the answer. Because they know that, you know, there's an old rule of thumb. Every point of compression you increase, just unplug the phones, guys. Unplug them from the server room, shut them down. All right, if we have to. Okay, sorry guys. All right, it's mostly out of ignorance. There's an old rule of thumb that says every point you increase compression ratio gives you 4% more power. And so they look at like, wow, I can do this. This new fuel's letting me run this compression ratio, let me do it. And what they don't know is for every action, there's a reaction. And although their thermal efficiency goes up, their volumetric efficiency drops. And the more boost pressure they're trying to run, the more it's a backwards move. And I'll give you an example there. Let's say somebody had, my glasses would be a good start. Oh, here, there. All right, let's say somebody had a 2-liter engine, right? So now we've got a 2-liter, right? And we're running 45 PSI boost, okay? And right now, it's making 800 horsepower, all right? Now, if we, and let's say right now the compression ratio is 8-to-1, all right? 8.0 to 1, and we're gonna go and make it 10-to-1. And then, and let's say we're at 8.0 to 1, and we're gonna go to 12-to-1, all right? So, let's say, so if we started at 8-to-1, we'll look at my little chart here, and we go to 10-to-1, guess what? Minus 4.8%. Our new horsepower with this setup is going to be 761.9 by making that change. Now, as most tuners do that make a change that they think is supposed to make more horsepower, they just keep cranking up the boost as the Band-Aid. But what actually happens is you lose horsepower. Now, it's even worse. If your engine was 8-to-1 and you go to 12-to-1, you're looking at, let's see, original 8-to-1 to 12-to-1, 740, where did it go? 740.5 horsepower. You lose about 7.4%. Now, these are not taking into effect or into account another factor called combustion efficiency. So these losses usually aren't this bad because there's generally some type of improvement to the combustion efficiency depending on how you got this reduction in compression ratio. Sometimes you can have some actual gains that help offset this loss, but by the same token, this was our 45 psi boost example, and let's just say, back when we were talking about a low boost application, 15 psi of boost, and let's do the same thing. We go from 8 to 1, and we go to 10 to 1. All right, what happens? So let me look at my chart here. We start out at 8 to 1, we go to 10 to 1, and guess what? Plus 0.8%. So now let's say this is our 400 horsepower engine. So we go from making 400 to making 403 horsepower. We picked up 3 horsepower by going from 8 to 1 to 10 to 1. We'd also pick up fuel mileage and stuff. So at lower boost levels, increasing that compression ratio can have a beneficial trade-off. But as we see, doing that same move as you start increasing the boost becomes detrimental. And that's one thing to kind of to look at as you're making these choices. And like I said, we're going to make it a lot easier. We'll have some calculators on there. But you should always kind of look at what the factory did originally. What was that original compression ratio and where you're going from there? Another question.
How do you determine the ideal amount of static compression for an NA build? When would you draw the line with the compression?
Most of the time for an NA all-motor build, it really comes down to the combustion chamber. What you're trying to do there is make the chamber as small as possible, but flow as good as possible. And let me grab a combustion chamber here so you can kind of see. This is your typical FA20 combustion chamber from a BRZ or 86 FRS, one of those. And we look at this combustion chamber, and we see, as we come in here, we see some of the things that they did on it. And what they tried to do, and I'll grab the piston to kind of show you, what they're trying to do here is take up all the areas that don't affect the flow. This area here is far enough away from these 2 valves that you can put some, take up some of this space with these bumps here. And it kind of ends up looking almost like a clover leaf. But what they're trying to do here with this setup is basically
75 degrees Fahrenheit with mostly sunny skies.
what?
Today,
Huh?
we look for intermittent clouds with a high
All right,
of
anyways.
77 degrees and a low of 62 degrees.
Just turn the volume down. Seriously? All right, anyways. What they're trying to do on an all-motor build is you're trying to minimize all of the volume and stuff that you have in here. You're trying to maximize the displacement, but minimize your unswept volume so that you can have the highest compression ratio, but you don't want to do anything that actually impedes the flow. And what we look at the other chamber here, now this is still the same engine, an FA20, but this is the WRX engine, turbocharged. And you see they don't care as much about what's happening with the flow coming in. They're not making as much relief here so that this is unshrouded and these breathe better, because right now it's being forced into the chamber anyway under boost, so it's going to fill the cylinder pretty easily. What they do incorporate here are these flat quench pads here, which when that other piston comes up, this is a Club DSPORT piston, and when it comes up, it's actually only about maybe 28, 30 thousandths away from that, and that really tight clearance forces all that air and fuel that's in there, creates extra turbulence and mixing, and has a really good combustion efficiency. So I hope that kind of answers what you're saying. On an all-motor application, you're trying to get the compression ratio as high as you can without impeding anything you do to the flow. What goes into the cylinder isn't just what how the port is shaped and the size of the valve you use. It's also, once it gets past that valve seat, what it needs to do and actually to get in the cylinder, and that's when the chamber shape and stuff plays a role. Another question?
No, we're caught up with the question.
Okay, so I guess right now, want to make sure everybody kind of has an understanding, and we're just going to go over it real quick one more time. What happens? Increasing the compression ratio, you get an increase in thermal efficiency, and that's the main reason why you get a benefit. The downside to increasing the compression ratio is you have the trade-off in losing your volumetric efficiency. That's number one that you should know. Number two, the ideal compression ratio goes down as boost goes up. So as you tend to boost more and more and more, if we're boosting 45 psi, changing from 8 to 1 to 10 to 1 is going to lose 4% power, or almost 5% actually. But same setup, going from 8 to 1 to 10 to 1, but we're only going to be seeing 15 psi a boost, we actually gain horsepower. So if you have an application out there, and you might look at some of the cars that are out there and stuff, and you'll see, I think, a few different racing bodies and stuff that have a high compression ratio and boosted. They're usually a very low boost level. And so that's why they kind of maximize it. Any other questions? Okay, so guys, we hoped you liked this. As you can see, a lot of stuff going on here, so we want you to get it all. We just did the Facebook Live so you could get a taste of what's going on, but we're going to have this content also in a YouTube video with some more produced charts and stuff like that you can follow along with. We're also going to have this as a article on dsportmag.com that you can click on and see the charts that are down there, and hopefully we'll even incorporate some calculators and stuff so you guys have a better idea, and you won't be one of those idiots trying to run 12 to 1 compression with the 85 and 60 pounds of boost, because